Hi all, this is Mr. Hopper. We're going to do a quick review for the final exam in Anatomy and Physiology 1. Now, my first comment is this. The first, say, quarter of the test, okay, a huge number of points, will simply be a large multi-part matching block. I'm going to be very straightforward with this. The first section will be autonomic versus somatic. So if it's an autonomic system reaction, you just put A for autonomic. If it's a somatic form of sensation, then you would put B somatic. So in other words, if it's something you are consciously aware of, that is somatic. So if you think flex bicep, that's a somatic reaction. Whereas if it's autonomic, it's something that you can't consciously control. Okay? So very simple. A for autonomic, B for somatic. That's how it's going to be. Just make sure you can understand and compare and contrast these two concepts of autonomic sensory and motor and somatic sensory and motor. The second part of this will be comparing the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions of your autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic A, parasympathetic B. Does it rouse the body for action? That would be sympathetic. Does it calm the body down? Well, that would be parasympathetic. I might tell you about certain receptor types, how some are stimulatory and some are inhibitory, like what are nicotinic receptors, for example. What are alpha and beta receptors, these types of things. Maybe I'll throw in something about acetylcholine or norepinephrine, you know. Maybe I'll ask about dual innervation or tonal mechanisms of the sympathetic nervous system. Like these are the types of questions I'm looking for, all right? And then, last but not least, the third aspect of this large matching block will be neural versus endocrine. Neural versus endocrine. Is it me thinking about flexing my bicep? Well, that will be neural. Is it my heart beating faster in an emergency situation? Well, that would be endocrine. All right. So neural versus endocrine will be the third large piece of this block of matching. All right, now, what else? So I believe I mentioned this a little bit already, but I'll mention it again. You should understand the concepts of how the sympathetic nervous system has some unique mechanisms involved with it. There are a slide or two that were titled something along the lines of unique roles of the sympathetic nervous system. If I were you, I would be friends with this. I would be able to go through and explain parts and pieces of things like, again, sympathetic tone. And then by comparison, whereas the sympathetic nervous system is alone in innervating things like your blood vessels. In other cases, both the sympathetic and parasympathetic division innervate in equal manner. So tell me about what's called dual innervation. Okay, dual innervation. Like how the sympathetic nervous system might calm the heart rate down, whereas the sympathetic division might speed the heart rate up. Tell me how that's possible, all right, using the concept of dual innervation. And let's see, generally speaking, realize that your hypothalamus runs the show in terms of your autonomic nervous system, whereas your other brain parts, like your cerebral cortex, for example, can certainly have an influence. So what are cortical influences as an example? Okay. All right, moving on. Let's talk about sensation. Let's start with the eye. So you should realize at this point that the cornea of your eye is the primary light-bending apparatus. Okay, it's going to bend light and direct it into the eye. It's the main job here. That light passes through the pupil, which is the size of the pupil, is dictated by the iris of the eye. Will allow either more or less light in, that will the iris, depending upon how bright the room is that you're in, or if you're outside, what have you. And the iris of the eye will also change size depending upon how close up or far away something is when you're looking at it. So understanding the use of the iris here is very important. Next in, you will run into the lens of the eye. So the lens of the eye is held in place by the ciliary body, and it has that ability to squeeze the lens or stretch the lens depending upon if you're looking at something far away versus close up, and I would know which one does which if I were you. That will focus light like a laser beam. Okay, if the cornea does the majority of the work and the lens kind of fine-tunes it, what they do is they focus light on what's called your fovea centralis, that's part of the retina of the eye. Okay, and the fovea centralis is very, very important for us. It's where most of the cone receptors of the eye are located. And again, cone receptors are on that what's called individual neural path by comparison to the rods of the eye, which are on what's referred to as a converging neural path. If I were you, I would know the difference between those. I would know the type of vision that's provided by rods versus cones, when cones are active versus when rods are active. And again, understanding that the fovea centralis, the main focus point of the eye, that is going to be where you find mostly cones. Now, that fovea centralis is very active, and as a result of that, we have that macula lutea that surrounds the fovea centralis. If I were you, I would know about the macula lutea, know why it's there, and understand what might happen if it ceases to function correctly. So that is the main concepts involved with the eye. And in terms of the physiology of the eye, if I were you, I would be able to kind of compare and contrast that fovea centralis versus, for instance, your optic disc. Be able to tell me what you would find in the anterior chamber of the eye versus what you'd find in the posterior chamber of the eye and how they're different. And be able to walk me through the concept of the near response. All right, so when you look at something far away versus close up, what happens with the eye? Like there were 2 or 3 concepts that were involved in the near response. If I were you, I would be best friends with those, best friends with them. And again, understanding that these rods and cones, what they do is phototransduction. Now, transduction is a very important word for us here, and you need to be able to use it. So, for instance, your rods and cones transduce light into action potentials. Your olfactory epithelium transduces smells into action potentials. Your taste cells, gustatory cells, transduce chemicals into action potentials. Just to understand the concept of transduction. All right. Let's see, what else do we have? All right, let's talk about the ears. So your outer ear kind of gathers sound waves. Those are directed into your auditory canal, which strikes your tympanic membrane, which vibrates. The vibrations in the tympanic membrane are directed through the malleus, incus, and stapes. Those are your ossicles, your ear bones. And they basically amplify sound waves that go into the cochlea. All right, the cochlea is part of your inner ear, and the cochlea is where you find the organ of corti, which allows you to perceive sound. Now, in that organ of corti, I would know about inner hair cells and outer hair cells. I would know about how you interpret pitch versus loudness. So where on the organ of corti are we vibrating versus the frequency of those vibrations, if you will, how many action potentials are being sent per unit of time from that area of the organ of corti. This is how we identify pitch versus loudness. Let's see, what else do I want to say here? And let's see, inner and outer hair cells, as well as what ions they utilize in order to depolarize and repolarize. It's not the worst idea ever. Let's see, and further in the inner ear, if I were you, I would know about the vestibule and the macula saculi and macula utriculi. Tell me how they kind of work. Tell me the difference between the macula saculi and the macula utriculi, and sort of what type of motion they perceive and where they might be found. Tell me about the semicircular canals and the cristae ampullari that's inside of there, and how they sort of help us to identify rotational movement. So understand the different parts of the inner ear and sort of how they're involved in doing the jobs that they do. All right, bear with me, folks. Let me see if I'm missing anything here. All right, I think that's pretty good. All right, what else do we have here? So there's olfaction. If I were you, I would know about the ions that enter into all your olfactory cells that allow you to perceive smell, and understand how they can build up and lead you to becoming what you might hear in commercials as being nose blind. It's referred to as olfactory adaptation. I would understand the concepts of olfactory adaptation and the ions involved. If I were you, I would understand why your gustatory cells are also chemoreceptors, but why they have to have such a really high, if you will, metabolic rate. Why would they divide so quickly? how is it that they can heal very fast? Why would they need that capacity? And let's see what else we have here. I have a few more endocrine concepts to cover. So if I were you, I would know about the neurotransmitters that are involved in pain reception and where those pain receptive messages go to the brain. And further, I would understand the roles of analgesic compounds that our bodies might release to help us to be able to tolerate pain sensations. So what are the neurotransmitters involved in nociception, and what hormonal signals, if you will, what hormonal signals might be used to numb pain sensations, if you will, in emergency situations. How does analgesic effects work? How do analgesic effects work? And last but not least, if I were you, I would be friends with the general concepts revolving around diabetes. Okay, so what hormones are involved in diabetes? Generally speaking, how do we regulate our blood sugar? What are the two different types of diabetes? And sort of when is their onset and what's involved in which? That is the idea here. And that's a good review of the final exam for anatomy and physiology. Again, about the first quarter of the test, maybe more, is going to be autonomic versus somatic, sympathetic versus parasympathetic, neural versus endocrine. Okay, just a matching block. I'll have like 5 questions. You know, tell me if it's a neural thing or an endocrine thing. And that's how this is going to work. All right, good luck, everybody. I hope you do fantastically well. And study, study, study. I will be grading them as quickly as possible and looking for any mistakes or errors. I think it's going to be good to go, but you should see your final grade by the end of next week, probably by Wednesday. All right, have a good day.